Hey guys, so I wanted to show you how to use exponents on a scientific calculator. Now, there are two types of scientific calculators. There's scientific calculators which are one-line calculators like this one, meaning you can only do like one line of work at a time. And then there are multi-line calculators which allow you to do multiple lines, and those allow you to like type out an entire expression, press enter, and it'll calculate everything for you. I don't have an example of that right now. The closest I can get is to this graphing calculator here, which you could type in like 9 plus 5 and it'll like do the work for you. And there are some scientific calculators that work like this, but the most common that you'll see are the single line calculators, which it doesn't show the operations, you just have to go one at a time. Basically, the way that these work is you type out what you're saying, basically. So for example, if you want to say 8 plus 2, you'll do 8, then you press the plus, and then you press the 2, and then you press equals 2, and then it'll give you 10, okay? So with exponents, it's much the same way, but there are a few buttons you have to pay attention to. So the main button you'll notice is this one. This is y raised to the x. The way this button works is you type the base of the exponent first, then this is like the raised to button, and then you press the exponent, and then you press enter, and then you'll get your answer. You'll also see this one that says x squared. This is only to square numbers. So for example, if you want to do 8 squared, you press 8, and then you press this button, and it gives you 64. But this button, this is only good when you're squaring things. But you don't really, you could also just do 8 raised to the 2, like that. And it doesn't really make a difference. So either or would work. But again, this one's only for squaring. For other exponents, you have to use this button. So for example, let's say you wanted to do 5 raised to the 3, 5 raised to the 3rd power, you would do 5 raised to the 3, and then you press equals, and you get 125. Now let's say you wanted to do 2 raised to the 7. So you would do 2 raised to the 7, and that gives you 128. So there you go. Okay, now roots are exponents. Now most scientific calculators give you the option to do a root. So for example, if you notice this button here, this is our square root button. Remember, if the radical does not have a number on the arm, is because it's root 2. It's the square root. So for example, if you wanted to do the square root of 64, you would type in 64 and then you press the square root button, which of course is 8. Now, another way you could do this is if you wanted to do 64 raised to the 1/2, which is the equivalent. This is where it's a little bit trickier, because if you want to raise it to an exponent, see, the problem is if you do 64 raised to the 1, what it's going to do right now is it's going to do 64 raised to the 1, and then when you put divided by 2, it's doing 64 divided by 2, which is not the answer that you want. If you wanted to do 64 raised to the 1/2, this is where, if you think of order of operations, you would always do the exponent first. So you actually need to do the 1/2 first. So there's many different ways of doing this. So for example, one way you could do this is you could do what's 1 divided by 2, and that's 0.5. So then you could say that that's 64 raised to the 0.5. You see, and you get the answer. Now, if you wanted to leave it as a fraction, you would have to use these 2 parentheses buttons. So for example, how would you do that? You would do 64, then you press raise to. Now you need to start the parentheses. So you press the open parentheses. Now notice here that little parentheses opened up right there. That means that right now anything you type is going to be in the parentheses. So now we could do 1 divided by 2. Now when you press the close parentheses button, it's going to calculate what the exponent is. So if you close it, you see you get 0.5, because what it did there is it's giving you the value of the exponent. So now when you press enter, it's going to do 64 raised to the 1/2, which is 8. So that's one way of doing it, and sometimes that's convenient. But again, square root is such an easy and such a commonly used uh, operation that they have a button reserved for that. So of course, doing 64 square root is a whole lot easier. Now, third root, that's a little bit of a different story, okay? So one way you could do it is the way that I showed you before, that you can do, for example, 8 raised to the open parentheses 1/3, close parentheses. You see that's 1/3. So when you press enter, it's going to calculate 8, or the third root, or 8 raised to the 1/3, which is 2. Now, the interesting thing is most of these calculators, if you notice up here, so notice above the exponent button, you'll see in green, or whatever color your calculator has, x root y. So the way to access these that are not on buttons but they're over the buttons is there's this second button here. When you press that second button, that activates the green above the buttons. So for example, if you want to do third root of 8, instead of doing 8 raised to the 1/3, what you would do instead is you would do 8, then you press the second button to activate this button, and then this is going to do root. Now I press that, and then I press 3, so that's the third root. And now I press enter, and I get 2. So let's do that again. So if you wanted to do the third root of 8, you would type 8, you type the base first, then you press second to activate the button above, so the root button, and then you type 3 to indicate third root. So we press 3, and then you press enter, and that gave us the third root of 8. Okay, so there's many different ways to do this because radicals are exponents, but there are buttons reserved for doing roots, really, of any kind. Or if you want to treat it as an exponent, you can do it, raised to the 1/3. Just remember to put that 1/3 in parentheses. Okay. Now let's see one that's a little bit trickier. 9 raised to the 3/2. So this means we're going to get the square root of 9 and then cube it. Or again, you could do 9 cubed and then square root it. So you can do this in one go. Of course, you could do 9 raised to the 3/2. So let's see what happens if we do that. So we'll do 9 raised. Now I have to do the parentheses, and I do 3/2, close parentheses, and then I press enter. And that gives me 27, which makes sense, right? The square root of 9 is 3, and then 3 cubed is 27. So that's one way of doing it. Okay. Or remember, this is a root and a power, so it doesn't really matter the order in which you do it. So you could either also use the root buttons if you want to do this. Now this is square root, so you can use the square root button. So for example, you could do 9 cubed first and then get the square root of that, which is 27. Or you can do square root of 9 first, so 9 square root, and then cube that. And at the end of the day, you get the same exact thing. So notice I did this in 3 different ways, and you get the same answer regardless. So it's totally up to you how you want to do that. Okay, and that's the basics of exponents. Again, radicals are exponents, so there is if you want to treat it as a radical and just use the root separately, you can use the root button. But if you want to treat the root as an exponent, which it technically is, you can also use the exponent button. Just remember to use those parentheses if that exponent is going to be a fraction. Okay. Now, let's talk about E real quick. So E is Euler's number. Okay, and it is another very famous irrational number like pi, which should be approximately 2.718. Now, you may look here and you may think, where's the E button? I mean, you see a pi button, but where's the E? Well, if you take a look, because E is normally used as the base of an exponent most of the time, not really as a standalone number. So you'll notice here in green, the E raised to the x. So what that means is when you press this button, whatever number you have typed first, it's going to do e raised to that number. So for example, let's say you wanted to just find the value of e, for example. So anything raised to 1 is itself. So if I were to press 1, and I have to press the second to activate the E button, and then I press this, what it did there is it did E raised to the 1, which is E. So 2.718, 281828, so on and so forth. So that's E, approximately. Okay. Now, let's say you wanted to do E raised to the 5. So you would do 5, you type the exponent first, and then you press E raised. And that gives us 148, approximately 148.413, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is e raised to the 5th. So when you're gonna be working with e raised to the x, you type the exponent first, and then you press the second to activate the e raised to the button, and then that gives us e raised to the 5th. Now let's say you want to do 3 times e. Well, you first have to find out what e is. So first we'd find out e, so we'd do e raised to the 1. So 1 e, so that's e raised to the 1. And then you multiply that by 3. And there you get 8.1548, and so on and so forth. And that is the basics of exponents. With a scientific calculator. Another interesting thing about these calculators is it always saves whatever value you calculated before. So let's say, for example, I wanted to do 5 times 3 plus 7, for example. Of course, you go in order of operations, you do the multiplication first, then you do the addition. So we would do first 5 times 3. Now, you press enter, and this gives us 15, of course. Now, you don't have to remember 15 and then erase everything. All you have to do is now click plus 7, and you basically just continue on the chain of operations. And then you press equals, and you get 22. Okay. Take, for example, you had 7 minus 2 times 10. Of course, you do order of operations first, so we'll do 2 times 10, which is 20. Now this one's a little bit trickier because now we have 7 minus 20. Now, most calculators have an option to save your answer and transfer it over. Now this is a little tricky. You actually have 2 different ways of going about this. One way is you could remember 20 and then just do 7 minus 20. And that gives you, of course, negative 13. Now, another thing you could do, let's go back to 20. So let's say you're left with 20 and you wanted to do 7 minus 20 without having to erase anything. Well, you could also think of this as negative 20 plus 7, if that makes sense. You see, if you were to rearrange that, you can't flip a subtraction, but you could think of this as adding a negative. So this allows you to switch the operations. So there is this negative button here that if you press this, it's going to turn whatever number you have here, it's going to change the sign. So if I press this button here, notice that made that negative 20. Now you could do plus 7 and you get negative 13. Alternatively, another way to do this is a third way, is you could also, even though there are no parentheses here, again, if you were to follow order of operations, you would do the multiplication first. So it technically wouldn't be wrong to think of this as 2 times 10 as being in parentheses. And you could also do that as well. So you could do 7 minus, now open parentheses, 2 times 10. Now again, when you close the parentheses, it calculates 2 times 10. But then when you press equal, it's going to do 7 minus 20, which is negative 13. So that's a third way as well. The moral of the story here is you can just carry on the chain of operations without having to erase anything. You just have to have kind of the skills to understand what you're doing. If you want to be safe, you can just go one step at a time and make sure to write all your steps. But if you really understand what you're doing, you could do this all in one go. So take, for example, you wanted to do 3 times 2 plus 5 raised to the 4, for example. Well, if we were to follow order of operations, first I would do the inside of the parentheses, so 2 plus 5. Then I'm going to raise that to the 4, raised to the 4. And then I'm going to multiply this by 3. And notice how I did not have to do any work. I was literally able to just jump from here to the final answer, just going one step at a time, of course, following the order of operations. So now what if, for example, you wanted to do 3 divided by 6 plus 2, for example. This one is another one that's a little tricky to do, but I'll show you a shortcut here. So one way you could do this is you could say 6 plus 2. Of course, we work on that first. And then you would say this is 3 over 8. Now again, this here is a little tricky to do because 8 is the second part of the division. So one thing you could do is you can erase the calculator and just do 3 divided by 8, which is 0.375. Now this is a trick. Not a lot of people know how to do this, and you don't really need to know how to do this, but it does make things very convenient. You could think of 3 divided by 8 as 3 times 1 over 8, if that makes sense. If you understand fractions and basic multiplication, division is just multiplying by a fraction. So an alternative way to do this is, let's say we're back at 8. You can get 1 over 8 by actually pressing this button here, the 1 over x button. All this does is find the reciprocal. Another name for this button is called the reciprocal button. Some calculators say x raised to the minus 1. And if you understand negative exponents, that just means finding the reciprocal. So 1 over x and x raised to the minus 1 are the same button depending on your calculator. So if I press this button after I have 8 here and I press this button, that's 1 over 8. And then I could multiply that by 3, which gives me the exact same number. So that's another way of doing division where the denominator is a little bit more complicated. Alternatively, a third way of doing this is you could do 3 divided by parentheses 6 plus 2, close parentheses, and then press equal, and you get the same answer. So there's many different ways to solve this without having to really do much work, and you could just go one step at a time. It just depends on your level of understanding. So, but if you feel more comfortable going one step at a time and writing each step out, I encourage that. That's totally okay to do as well. But with practice, you should be able to solve any crazy computation with just one step at a time on your calculator and go straight to the final answer. So I hope that helped a little bit in understanding how to use a scientific calculator. Of course, there are so many other things that this calculator can do, but this is really just the basics, especially for exponents and basic order of operations. So I hope that helped, and have a great day.